Welcome back. Today we are talking with Dr. Robert Sinclair, co-author of the article Employee Characteristics to Promote Resilience, that was found in the book Managing for Resilience. Uh, Dr. Sinclair, great first segment, lots of good information there. Part of what you write about, you talk about a model called power, and I'm wondering if you could define that. What is the power model?
Sure. The power model is, I had to think of a catchy acronym in case I ever try to go in business and make money with some of this stuff, which I'll probably never get around to. But I always envisioned a book called Harnessing Your Personal Power I write about. But so if you remember, I talked about the two different approaches to defining resilience, where I said there's a demonstration approach and a capacity approach. And then the capacity approach looks at different kinds of personal qualities that people might have that might lead them to be more resilient. Um, as a researcher looking at that literature, what you'll find is that there's all sorts of different research approaches to studying these personality characteristics. And one researcher might say that, well, resilience is characteristics A, B, and C. Another researcher might come along and say that it's characteristics B, D, and F. And the third one might say it's F, G, and also part of B. So what I was interested in writing about for that chapter was trying to identify what I saw as kind of cross-cutting themes across some of the different personality models that people have used. So I wouldn't call it a formal theory per se, but more of a set of, here are some themes in the personal qualities that people study that are related to resilience. And so the POWER acronym, the P stands for purpose. So that purpose in this model is kind of a dispositional sense of being able to find meaning in your life. That this comes mostly from literature on a characteristic called hardiness, where they talk about people being engaged in their life and that they wake up every day and they feel like they've got meaningful stuff to do. And kind of the opposite of it is people that feel like life is sort of pointless and kind of disconnected from people around them. So the hardiness researchers see that in part as a trait, that some people are just better able to find purpose and meaning in their lives than others. The O is for optimism. And a lot of psychological models just talk about the benefits of a positive, healthy outlook on life and thinking that the future is going to be good, being able to see the positives in people, experiencing positive emotions. And we know that that's highly protective for people. You
Is
look like
that
you're going to ask something.
is that yeah, I couldn't help but think I've known some optimistic people, that they see the good in everything,
Right.
and they're kind of labeled as, delusional people. How can anyone be so positive? And you see
Yeah,
it on TV every so often as well with people. So how do you distinguish optimism versus someone who's just maybe in denial of something?
yeah, no, it's a good question. I think that some of the thinking and personality looks at three kinds of characteristics. What we talk about is normal personality traits. So those are characteristics that differentiate among the population of interest. Personality disorders, where it's be like schizophrenia or something like that. And then what some people call subclinical personality traits, which are kind of maladaptive but don't quite reach to the level of having a personality disorder. So, for example, you could make a distinction between someone who's just got a healthy, natural level of optimism, but in a realistic sense, versus somebody who might have a, subclinical kind of, potentially maladaptive optimistic outlook. And, so here I think we're mostly talking about people that fall into that normal range. But I think with any of these qualities that we study, there's a recognition that, too much can be a bad thing. Right. So, another example is the W in this model is I used it as willpower. One of the traits that people study there is called conscientiousness, which is a preference for structure and order and, being able to follow rules and things like that. And we know from a lot of research in industrial psychology and in health psychology that more conscientious people tend to do better in life. Right. But we also know that if you're too oriented towards structure and order, we start to talk about things like obsessive compulsive traits,
Mhm.
right? And then all the way into a full-blown obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And so I think there's a recognition of a threshold there where we'd say kind of within a normal range of, whether it's optimism or willpower or whatever, that, that those traits are adaptive to a point, but then beyond that point, they could be potentially maladaptive. The science side of it, I think, is that the way people study optimism with their personality questionnaires, or just have questions like I tend to see the positive in things. The scores on those wouldn't really differentiate somebody who's got a normal healthy level of optimism versus somebody who is sort of off the charts. And I don't think those measures are really designed to capture the kind of the off the charts person. Like another example is self-esteem, right? That we know that self-esteem is a good thing. It's critical to human development, but we also know that too much self-esteem is narcissism and leads to all sorts of problems, right?
Yeah.
So there's always a kind of an area there, a threshold that you cross in conceptualizing these ideas where too much of a good thing is usually not good.
So that's what's E.
So with E, we talk about emotional stability, which is kind of the classic and probably the most studied characteristic in personality psychology, is called either emotional stability, or sometimes it's referred to by its opposite, which is neuroticism. So that there's two real key characteristics that I think define this more than any other. People who are emotionally stable tend not to be emotionally reactive to events, so that they're the people that tend to be calm and cool and collected under pressure, versus the people that really have intense reactions. And then the other part of it is people that tend to be prone to negative mood states. And so if you put those two together, that the more harmful view is a person who tends to be both emotionally reactive and prone to negative mood states, are going to be a person who's going to kind of by definition have more intense negative reactions to stressors. And then sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so the last one is the R, is resourcefulness, which is basically, I just use this kind of a grab bag label for, there's a variety of different traits that refer to people's belief in their own capacity, right? So self-esteem, which sometimes people talk about self-efficacy. There's challenge, and the hardiness literature fits in here, but basically an idea that, I feel confident that I can do what I need to do in most situations in my life. And so the point of the power model is that these are just different themes in this literature that different researchers use. And I like this as a model and teach it to my students just as a way to think about the kind of the broad landscape of personality traits that people study, and what are some of the common themes across different models in this literature.
Could resourcefulness also incorporate the idea of the family and friend networks that are out there too? If someone is experiencing something, from a negative stressor, that they have a support system in place. They know where they could go for assistance, shall we say? Instead of freaking out.
Sure. Yeah. No. So yeah, I wouldn't put it as part of the power model, because I wouldn't conceptualize that as a personality trait.
Okay.
But certainly, if you think about capacities that support resilience, social support is absolutely crucial. And we probably have more evidence about that than we do anything else in this area, about the importance of social support, whether it's your family or at the workplace, right? We know that people that have supportive supervisors do better, and stay longer and work harder and go above and beyond the call and experience better health outcomes. So we also, there's a construct called perceived organizational support, which is basically, to what extent do I feel like my organization cares about me as a person? And we know that people that are higher on that tend to be higher on job satisfaction and productivity and health and well-being, and a whole variety of other beneficial outcomes. So I think it's that kind of support is absolutely critical. I just wouldn't talk about it as part of personality. I think it's another part of the kind of the mix in terms of promoting resilience.
Okay. I'm just wondering, as you were going through the purpose, optimism, etc., you said quite a bit that you go too far or not enough, and you have different problems. So, is it fair to say a resilience person is kind of stable in the middle of those areas? Not too much of this, not too much of that, but a good mixture, a good balance.
Yeah, I think certainly that you don't want extremes for sure.
Yeah.
I think what you probably ideally want is a little bit of all of these things, right? And so that you want people that can find meaning in their lives, and not to the point where they're kind of inventing reality, but you want a healthy level, I guess is what you'd say. And I think that's true with all of these, that they're all going to be beneficial, and I think they're all related to each other to a degree, right? So that
Mm.
the people who find it have more sense of purpose are probably going to be more optimistic, and maybe also be a little bit more emotionally stable. But yeah, I think that I think what we certainly want is balance. I think that you don't want to overcorrect, in any of this stuff. But I think that some kind of, I'd say, stable to high level of each one would be good without going to the extremes.
You mentioned something near the end there, perceptual effects. What did you mean by that? Because that term kind of caught my attention. Like, oh, what's that?
Um, just now I said that.
Yeah, you were talking about perceptions and perceptual effects, and you were talking about organization there, and I just kind of, oh,
Oh,
what was
sorry,
that?
sorry, sorry. You mean the perceived organizational support stuff?
Oh, perceived. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I wrote, well, I can't
Uh,
read my own writing. I wrote perceptual.
right. So yeah, so that's an idea in industrial psychology that is a pretty simple one. Is developed by a guy named Robert Eisenberger, who came up with this notion that um, we have a relationship with our organizations, and they call it the old researchers call it the personified organization. In other words, we behave toward our organizations as if they were a person in many ways, so that we ascribe intent. Clemson University is treating me well, or Clemson University is screwing me over. So it's a relationship that I have that's based on my sense of treatment. And Eisenberger proposed this notion of perceived organizational support, which is a sense that people have that their organization values their contributions, cares about their well-being, cares about them as a person. And there's a whole body of evidence now, I think hundreds of studies that show that people that have a stronger sense of perceived organizational support tend to be healthier. They tend to be more willing to stay in the organization. They tend to be willing to go above and beyond the call for the organization. They tend to work harder, be more loyal, et cetera. So yeah, that's another area of this kind of research that there's a good deal of scientific evidence to support the importance of that idea.
Well, let's carry the idea of organizations another step further. What can organizations do to help promote resilience amongst themselves, the leadership, their employees, the overall organization? What can they do to promote?
Yeah, so I'll give you an answer focusing on people, right, rather than kind of the organization level.
Yeah.
But I mean, we think about, I think, the whole system of talent management, right? It can be kind of baked into that, so that when we select, when we use hiring systems, resilience may be a part of that, whether it's personality testing or some other method that you have to try to figure out how a person is going to be able to deal with the stressors of a position. It's in the onboarding process that there may be training programs that lead people to cope with to be prepared to cope with the stressors of the experience. I was in the Marine Corps when I was 17, and a lot of Marine Corps boot camp, I think, is about kind of simulating the conditions that they expected you to experience out in the field. So that it's training you to prepare you for those kinds of exposures. Reward systems is maybe tricky. That's maybe a separate conversation. But I think certainly when we talk about leadership, we were talking offline that, I think the first thing for many leaders, I think, is, are they resilient themselves? Are they good role models of what they want their employees to be? So that we see many times that leaders will talk about how much they care about employee health and well-being, but they're working, 18-hour days and ignoring their family and, doing all sorts of other things that don't portray that model. Or they're rewarding people that engage in the unhealthy behavior themselves, right? So I think it's just kind of part of it is, I think, aligning your reward system so that you're not saying we care about health and well-being on the other hand, one hand, and then rewarding stuff that's unhealthy on the other hand. And so I think that alignment is there. I think also, with industrial psychology, one of the things that many people in my field would do would be to participate in employee engagement surveys, and so that regularly monitor how the workforce is doing to see if they have problems in a particular area, and then try to identify interventions where they can. So I think there's just really at each phase of that kind of talent management cycle, there's occupational health and resilience issues can come into play. And we also wrote about in the chapter a little bit about this kind of dark side of resilience. At least that's in the article I wrote about. Amy Adler, who's a military researcher, has written some, I think, really cool stuff on this, where she points out that there's some potential traps of trying to be an organization that focuses on resilience. One thing she talks about is that if you have a high focus on resilience, that can stigmatize the acknowledgement of mental health problems. So an example beyond the military is there's Kevin Love, who is a basketball player, currently plays for Cleveland. And he came out a few years ago talking about his panic attacks. And it was a big breakthrough because there's such a culture in professional sports of being unwilling to admit when you have a mental health problem, right? And so that it was a big breakthrough for him to say, look, yeah, I have these problems and other people do too, and we've got to help them get help with it.
And there's always such a big push, if you're someone on that level, oh, well, then you must have good mental health.
Right. And, or that if you got a problem, you just shut up and deal with it.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's certainly, we've got our NFL football playoffs now, and there's players are hurt and they're saying, they're going to be there on Sunday, no matter what happens, and no matter what happens to them in the future, So Adler writes about that, the idea that an overemphasis on resilience can potentially be stigmatizing for people who have problems, I think, as an issue in terms of the dark side, where people may be unwilling to acknowledge when they have a mental health problem. And, I think certainly what you want to do with that notion of perceived organizational support is promote resilience in part by letting people know when you've got a concern, it's okay to come to me or to go to your employee assistance program or whomever and try to get the help that you need, and we'll be there to support you. And, that, I think when employees believe that, it's going to be, the benefits to organizations are going to be tremendous in terms of, developing this kind of idea of a resilient culture.
So that got me thinking that resilience isn't just responding to a stressor, it's also identifying that there is a stressor or acknowledging that there is one.
Yeah, sure. If you think about the stress response process, we talk about it. The first step is that there's a stimulus, right? That something happens, and then you need to figure out, is this relevant to me, and do I need to worry about it? It's kind of one of the standard models. And then can I cope with it? And that it becomes harmful when people say this is relevant to me, I've got to deal with it, and maybe I don't feel like I have the resources I need to be able to cope with it. That's when stressors start to become harmful. And so that resilience comes into play there by in part by shaping what we see as stressors, number one. So when I talked about that idea of sense of purpose, right, or the idea of resourcefulness, that both of those speak to, something that one person might see as one of my students might see their first test coming up in a couple of weeks as a horrible pain in the butt that they have to go and prepare for. Another one might see it as an individual challenge. That's an interesting way to demonstrate their knowledge, right? And so that it's the same event, and depending on the typical way that they tend to interpret that, they may experience a health consequence, or they may, have an opportunity to perform really well. So it's, I think it's, the personality traits become the filter in part through which we interpret those events in the world, and then also kind of how we respond to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, believe it or not, we only have 4 minutes left.
Right.
Could you take 3 minutes and kind of give us any final thoughts or some things that maybe we didn't touch on here? Because you did touch on so much in these 2 articles here, and I'm sure we have barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, so I mentioned I always like to get a plug in from my field of occupational health psychology. And we have a professional organization called the Society for Occupational Health Psychology, which is really more for academic researchers. But I would encourage anybody that's interested in this area to check out what's called the Total Worker Health Movement. And that's a movement started by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health to promote worker safety, health, and well-being in terms of integrated strategies, and so that businesses are involved in that total worker health movement. And they have lots of resources in their own professional organization now. And I think the other big point is really within my field, to keep in mind that most of our talk today is talking about personality. And, those are characteristics that people bring with them to organizations, and maybe the organization helps them develop to a degree, but they're the part of people that doesn't change that much. And in our field, I think we also have a strong value system around kind of prioritizing the work environment. That in where there's problems at work that are associated with health, I think the first question we ask is, what can we change in the work environment to be able to, lessen this health problem? We don't ask the question first, which of our workers are going to be able to deal with the awful conditions that we created for them. So, I think that our value system is really all about change the work environment first, and then, hopefully you promote resilience along the way. But if you get both of those in kind of a comprehensive approach, that's kind of the optimal approach to promoting worker safety, health, and well-being.
Sticking on the individual level, I just want to ask one final question. Do you have any tips for someone out there who wants to make a change, to develop some of these characteristics that we talked about earlier on? Do you have any tips on how they might go about doing that, without having to put themselves in some sort of a stressful situation to try and, make a change? But any tips that they may be able to start looking at something different or go someplace, to help them move forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, we were talking about this with our kids last night, with my son in particular, that I think there is a notion of being willing to put yourself in situations that are at least a little bit uncomfortable, and recognizing the value of that. That I think some people would think of resilience as kind of like a muscle that you develop over time, and you develop it by using it, right? You don't become resilient by never facing stress. And so that doesn't mean, I'm not saying, sign up for the military and go and fight in the Middle East and then you'll be resilient. But I think you can find things in your life that are maybe a little bit uncomfortable for you and start to challenge you. Maybe that's having a difficult conversation with someone that you might want to avoid, or putting yourself in a public speaking role, or taking on a task that you don't feel 100% confident in your ability to do it, but maybe you feel 90%. Right. I think those are the ways in our daily life that we kind of build up these kind of qualities that lead us to become more resilient. And I think that, those are the kinds of things that you can do on a daily basis to just make yourself a little bit uncomfortable. And then I think you'll grow as a person as a result.
I like what you mentioned there about muscle memory in
Yeah.
the business continuity, disaster recovery realms, where we're testing and exercising plans. We're always talking about, utilizing people and in all these different situations so that they can get that muscle memory going and they get familiar with things, and they are putting themselves in situations that they normally wouldn't be, even though we're simulating a disaster. But it gets people comfortable. It moves them, forward, and stimulates, their thought processes and how they respond and things like that. So we use that term quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about playing guitar beforehand or playing piano and
Yeah.
the keyboard. And, I think a lot of that is like you practice the stuff to the point where you don't have to think about it when you're doing it. And then
Yeah.
you can improvise in the moment if you need to. But it's, I think having that good foundation really goes a long ways toward, promoting resilience, both for individuals and for organizations.
Yeah. And on that note, we've come to the end of the show. Dr. Sinclair, thank you so much for joining. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope a lot of people listen to this, because it was a nice, different take on resilience, the individual, which is a lot of what I've been talking about lately. Is stop worrying about plans and processes, look at the individual. So I'm really glad you could join us today.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And I encourage people to check out the book. And if anybody has any follow-up questions, they can just shoot me an email at rsincla@clemson.edu. And always happy to chat. So thank you
And
again.
well, thank you. And that book, once again, Managing for Resilience. And it's the second essay in there, so you don't have to go far to find it. It's a great paper. Thank you once again for joining us, and everyone watching and listening. Stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.